Hello, this is the second part of the neural structure and the neural transmission lectures. And the first part, I spoke about neural structure, the structure of the neuron, and how two neurons synapse and they, start to communicate. Now we are going to look deeply into the transmission itself, neural transmission, how neurons pass on signals to other neurons. More importantly, how the action potential in a neuron is produced and the chemical substances and the electromagnetic substances, charges that make neural transmission a possibility. So let's begin. First, we begin with the atomic level. This part, in order to understand it well, you need to understand chemistry, you need to understand biology. So this is why we ask people to take biology and chemistry in order to be speech-language pathologists. So first, the smallest kind of amount of matter, or the smallest kind of matter, is the atom. And atoms have inside of them protons, and they have neutrons. These make like the substance of the atoms. Neutrons are neutrally charged. They do not attract, they do not propel. Protons, they are positively charged. It means they have a positive charge, an electric charge. Now, every atom has shells, and it can go from one shell, like one sphere where one electron spins around, or it can be multiple shells. So the outside shell of a neuron, of an atom, determines its properties. If it's going to bind with, connect with another atom to form other things, or if it's going to, kind of be attracted or be neutral, and so on. Electrons, each electron has a negative charge. Negative charge. Negative charges attract positive charges. So an atom by nature it has an equal number of protons and electrons by nature. So this way, positive charges inside and negative charges of the electrons are attracted to each other, and this is how electrons stay. However, in some cases, some atoms lose an electron from the outside, the external shell. Only the electrons on the external shell, on the outer shell, make a difference. So some atoms, just by nature, can lose an electron. Now, we said, think about this situation. You must have the same number of protons, like the number of electrons. Protons have positive charges. We write plus. Electrons have negative charges. So for every electron, there is every proton, there is an electron. Now you come to a situation, if the one atom loses one electron, then inside how many protons are you going to have? In this example, we just have 5. And in the other one, and then how many electrons? You have 4. So are there more positive charges or negative charges? So I hope you said positive. In that case, that atom that has now lost an electron and it becomes positively charged instead of neutral, that is called an ion. Ion. Okay, so an ion is an atom that either loses an electron or gains an electron. Because, I mean, the electron is not going to go somewhere else. It's going to go to be transferred to another atom. So the atom that gains an electron, in addition to what it has, that atom also becomes an ion. So, for example, look here. Here's the outside shell of Na is sodium. The outside shell of sodium. How many electrons does it have in the outside shell? So it has one. So as you keep going, it only has one. So it is going to lose that electron. And then now the whole orbit now has nothing there. So you just have two orbits here, and the inner one has two electrons. The outer one has 2, 4, 6, 8, which are here as well. So, but the most important one is the external shell. So the external shell had one electron originally, and that is lost. So now you have one atom that has one more proton more than an electron, and that atom is now an ion. We call it ion. So the atom that loses one or gains one electron is an ion. And then I'll tell you what we call each one. So, again, the reason that we just now notice, instead of saying here in the first shell, Na, that is plain sodium, a sodium atom. If you have next to it plus or minus, naturally that is an ion. You say plus or minus. So it's either negatively charged or positively charged. So if the atom gains, the atom is neutral, and it gains one electron, will it be positively charged or negatively charged? You answer that question based on what I have just said. So an electron, an atom that loses one electron, it becomes positively charged. We call it a cation. So a cation is one atom that has lost one electron, which is one negative charge. Now the atom that gains an extra charge, an extra electron, then now it has gained one negative charge. So that becomes a negatively charged atom, and that is called an anion. So here it is. An atom by nature is neutral. It doesn't, basically, the number of neutrons in it, protons in it are equal to the number of electrons. Negative charges are equal to positive charges. So if one atom loses one electron, then it naturally, because it has more positive charges, it becomes positive. It is called cation. If the atom gains an electron, that means instead of being neutral, it has one negative charge. So by itself, it becomes an ion. Sodium and potassium are two of 4 very, very important ions. We have sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride. So all of these are very, very critical for nervous system and body function. So, on a cell membrane, as I explained it before, let's see. On a cell membrane, you can see now inside of the cell, that is called intracellular or cytoplasmic side. Outside of the cell is the one above. That's called extracellular space or side. So now, because we said sodium and potassium, and the other two, calcium and chloride, but we'll worry about sodium and potassium because they are what basically drives the action potential that enables what enables a neuron to fire. There are three kinds of gates across the membrane channels that allow calcium and potassium to go in and out. So pay attention to these kinds because that's really, really important. So first, there are sodium channels that allow only sodium to go in and to go out. And then there are calcium channels that allow only calcium to go in and to go out. And then there are channels that are they allow both potassium and sodium to go in and out. So we'll speak about these and we'll see how they determine. Some of these channels are left open all the time. They have no, basically, they're left open like this. And some of them are gated channels. They allow ions only when there is something that causes them to open. So whether an electric charge increases or decreases, it makes them open. But there are gates for both sodium and calcium that are opened all the time. Things, come in and out freely. And then the sodium-potassium pump or the sodium-potassium channel that is going to control the transport of sodium and potassium at the same time, and we'll explain how this works. So naturally, the cell membrane of a neuron has more potassium channels. It has more potassium channels by nature. Second, most of these potassium channels remain open all the time. And on the opposite side, sodium has less channels, and most of these channels remain closed all the time. So, when the neuron is resting. So, again, the small number of sodium channels, by nature, it is smaller than, the number is smaller than potassium. So by nature, there's less. But even though there are less channels, even those channels, not all of them are open. So usually just a few are open during when the neuron is resting. So now let's look at the situation. You have, say, two containers. Let's say here, two containers. And you take one container and you make a pipe in between and connect them. This container, let's say, has more liquid. Let's say, pretend that this container is the same size as this. So this one has more liquid than this, and you connect them together, and then you open that connection, that like faucet or something in between. Where will, in what direction will the fluid flow? How will it diffuse? Will it diffuse from the one that has more to the one that has less, or the one that has less to the one that has more? Of course, we know the answer. We call this, when the fluid flows from areas of higher concentration to areas of lower concentration, we say it has diffused across its gradient. It means it is piled up here. When you give it a chance, it's going to diffuse. It's going to go to the other side, naturally flow until the two containers have equal amounts. Okay? That point would be equilibrium in that case. So that is a natural kind of law that things flow from higher concentration to areas of lower concentration. So, because when we explain the situation, we look at the other two sides of the membrane, we are going to find that inside of the cell, always, there is more potassium inside the cell than outside. This is one thing. What about sodium? In that case, there is more sodium outside than inside. And the specific ratio that I'm going to explain. The situation now, because of the natural tendency of how this is distributed, when you have the sodium channels closed most of the time, there are less, channels by nature. Then naturally, the sodium that is outside the cell membrane cannot get in, and only just a few ions are going to get in, through these channels. Now, potassium is mostly inside of the shell, and the gates are mostly open. So what direction do you think potassium wants to flow? From inside the cell to the outside, or from outside to in? Again, think about it. Think about the gradient, and you should be able to answer the question. So, the idea is that now you have a membrane. And inside of the cell, there are potassium ions, and there's a few sodium ions. And outside of the cell, there are more sodium ions and a few potassium ions. That situation makes it that the outside sodium wants to go in all the time, but the gates, there are not enough gates, and most of the gates are closed. And that also makes the inside of the cell, the potassium wants to exit all the time, because it wants to diffuse from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. As ions move in and out of the cells, remember, every ion, now calcium or potassium is positively charged. So, in that case, it wants to move from areas of low concentration to areas of areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So the situation always prefers that sodium goes in when it has a chance, and that potassium goes out when it has a chance. So let's look here. We have a channel here, and you can see it has a gate, that little lock in the bottom of it, and it is closed at rest potential, that's closed. And then when a neurotransmitter, for example, binds or something happens here, it is going to open it so that it will allow the ions to go in, sodium here in that case. So, but here it is closed. So now, or if there's an action potential that causes it to open, it is going to bring in sodium from outside to the inside, to the cytoplasmic side. As the ions move in, the electric charges, they will create what is called voltage. Voltage is the separation, it's an electric current that results from separation of charges. You have positive and negative charges inside of the membrane, and positive and negative charges outside. And as they go in and out and increase here and decrease there, they create an electric current. They create voltage. So that is electricity. So then, once, for example, they reach a certain level, the ions, the sodium's inside, or at the end of the action potential, then the cell closes again after it allows, the enough sodium in. It's going to close. And then the cycle goes, again. So, the difference now, again, when we look at it, the difference in the amounts of calcium inside the cell and outside, and the amounts of potassium inside and outside, and the amounts of sodium. So that difference here is going to create a situation where potassium always wants to go out and sodium always wants to go in. But as you could see, these channels that I told you, potassium channels that remain open all the time, you could see that they function by simple diffusion. Like if you have more on one side, it tends to flow to the other side that has less. And you can see how this is done. And in addition to that, there are active transport channels. Like the sodium-potassium pump is an active. It means it is going to take out charges. For example, let's say outside there is less potassium. Inside there is more potassium. Naturally, we said potassium wants to leave from inside to go to outside. But that is, in that case, the active transport channel is going to bring more potassium in. It's like, almost like think about the membrane as a dam. And there's a river. And then there's a dam here. And then the dam behind it, the water just is rising and very high. And then the other side, the water is very low because the water is dammed. So naturally, the water behind the dam wants to go over the other side. And if it has a chance to go over, that is called diffusion. And the lower side, as if that is not enough, if you get a pump, a big gigantic pump, put it in that river and pump the water to the other side, then you are transporting the water against its gradient. And in order to transport it against its gradient, you must have some kind of energy. You must have gas. You must have some kind of electricity, something to make the pump work. So the channel that carries sodium and potassium in and out, the sodium-potassium pump channel, is called pump because it pumps sodium and potassium from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. So, and in order to do that, it has to use energy. It uses a molecule called ATP. So it is an active transport pump. It's a pump that actually works in order to increase the negative charges inside of the cell. So now, look at this pump. On its external surface, it is not shown as well here, but let's see. It has 3 spots, 1, 2, 3 on the left. 1, 2, 3. This is to bind sodium. Sodium is the rounded ion here. Potassium is the square. So that pump has 1, 2, 3 places for sodium. So when it is opening from inside, sodium is going to come in. First, it's going to bring two potassiums from outside, because it has two spots on the other side for potassium. So as it opens up to the inside, it's going to dump in two potassiums. And before it closes, it is going to take out three sodiums. So 1, 2, 3. And then as it goes, as it fits them in, then it opens up like this, and the 3 sodiums are released outside of the cell. And then before it closes, it is going to attract 2 potassiums, and then closes and goes in and dumps them. And before it closes, 3 sodiums are going to bind, and then it closes. And so every time it cranks, it's going to allow 3 sodiums out of the cell. And it will bring 2 potassiums in the cell. This is going to have meaning. Just wait, I'm going to explain. In a membrane, while I have the image here, there is a steady rate of potassium inside the cell. The amount of potassium inside the cell is 140 ions. Again, 140 ions. Keep a pen or a pencil with you and do some calculations for me. So potassium by nature inside of the cell is 140 ions. Each one of these ions has a positive charge. And outside of the cell membrane, there are 5 potassiums. So far, 145. So 140 inside, 5 outside. So what direction do you think potassium wants to flow? Again, the reason is it wants to flow from inside to the outside. At the same time, sodium inside, there are 15 ions inside. So 15 positive charges inside. And outside, there are 150 sodiums. So let's calculate now. What matters now is this. You have a membrane and you separate the charges. How many positive charges are inside now from potassium and calcium, sodium and potassium? How many positive charges are outside from sodium and potassium? Do the calculations. So inside there are 140 potassium and 15 sodium. Outside there's 150 sodium and 5 potassium. Count and tell me how many positive charges in all. Positive, both calcium and potassium and calcium are positive charges. So I'm not speaking about what is what now. We're just speaking the number of charges inside the cell, positive, and the number that is outside, that is positive. So again, 140 plus 15 equals 155. How about outside? 150 plus 5, what does that equal? 155. So the inside charges, positive charges inside, are equal to the positive charges outside. So again, if you leave things based on the diffusion gradient, natural gradient, sodium wants to come in and potassium wants to go out, but that doesn't work this way. The gates of sodium make it impossible for all sodiums to come in, but the potassium wants to go out. Because of this, and because of the difference in charges, like say there is more here and less out of each one, they create a situation where they create that voltage, and that voltage, the electric potential now, it means when there are positive charges inside, they will be attracted by negative charges outside. And when there are positive charges outside, they are attracted by the positive are attracted by the negative charges inside the cell. Because there are negative charges, chloride, ions, and also amino acids that act as ions as well. So there are negative charges also inside and negative charges outside. But what is inside matters a lot. So every time one thing goes in and out, it kind of creates that voltage. And now that steady balance between the number of positive charges inside, we said 155 inside, 155 outside. If one sodium comes in, what do you think is going to happen to the potassium? It wants to maintain. So this is how it wants to be. 155 charges inside, 155 outside. So if you allow one sodium in, you are going to have one potassium exit, because the channels are freely open for potassium. So anytime, for any reason, whatever reason, you have sodium come in, then it's like having a room that only has enough seats, and then one sodium comes in, to find the seat now, then one potassium leaves out and takes the seat of the sodium outside. So every time you have it this way. So at equilibrium, at rest, the cell really never reaches equilibrium, but at rest, there are 150 sodium ions outside and only 15 inside. And potassium, there are 140 ions inside and 5 outside. If you calculate, you are going to add 150 to the 15, that's 155. And then the outside, you have 150 plus 5, then that's 155. And they are equal positive charges. And if one sodium comes in, naturally one potassium is going to leave. Now, in terms of the electric voltage, because of the difference of the potassium inside and related to the number of charges outside, it has a negative, the cell itself, naturally, inside of the cell, is going to have greater negative charges than positive. So by nature, every ion has its own charges by nature. So when you calculate everything at rest, then the cell by nature is going to have very decreased, it's going to have much more negative charges inside than outside. So the difference between the number of the charges inside the membrane and outside the membrane, that difference determines the electrochemical gradient of the cell membrane. When we say electrochemical, it has two pieces. We see the chemical component. When one chemical element is in higher concentration, it wants to flow into the other side of low concentration. This is one piece. If it is, so that is flowing or diffusing, based on its gradient in the direction of lower concentration. So that's chemical diffusion. And I told you that when each ion has a charge, negative or positive. So when that ion goes from one side to the other, if that ion is negative, it goes to the other side, it will increase the negativity of the outside. And if that there's a positive ion that leaves this, the cell, as it exits, it increases the positive ions outside, increases positive charges, but it decreases the number of negative charges, because negative and positive, this is how they balance each other. They are attracted. So the attraction between negative and positive charges, that's an electric attraction. And that is the part of electro. So when you have 100 and say, when you have, excuse me, you have more negative charges inside. By nature, these will attract, they have electricity, they want to attract the positive charges outside. This is why positive charges will be outside next to the membrane, and negative charges inside will be also next to the membrane, because they're attracted to each other, but the membrane is separating them. And by separating them, then you have you have created the voltage. So again, because at rest, there are less sodium channels than potassium channels, and only a few sodium channels are open. So for this reason, naturally, the potassium wants to leave, to exit, and there are many gates that allow it to freely go in and out, across their gradient. And the sodium ions always want to come in, but the gates are mostly closed. So whenever a gate is opened to allow one sodium, then one potassium will exit. So the sodium potassium channel or pump, as I mentioned, it is going to take more potassium from outside where there's less, and it brings it in where there's more. And it will bring more sodium, say 15 sodiums inside, it's going to take out of them and dump it outside to where there's more. So it works against the current. So by doing so, I'm going to explain to you how the sodium-potassium channel actually increases the negativity of the cell. So pay attention. First, let's look at the gates, the nature of the gates. Channels that transport ions against their gradient, like that river dam, and you want to take water from the lower end and pump it behind, to the other side where there's more water behind the dam. So you need more energy, you need to expend energy, but by doing so, you are increasing the potential of that water on the other side of the dam. So if you open a gate in the dam, you are going to have a more powerful current coming in. Or, by, say, for example, loading or pulling, you have a bow and arrow and you are pulling the string back. The farther you pull, the more you are loading. So this acts just like that. The active transport channel, by expending energy to pump things against the current, they are building energy to be used for a certain purpose. And again, this is why it's called the pump. So the pump, by transporting, the molecule, the ions to the other side that has more, they are actually building voltage. They are building electric potential. And this is just how your phone battery, by the way, works. You have one compartment and another compartment. One compartment has negative charges, one has positive. And then when you connect them, you want to have the negative attract the positive. As they come in, they create that energy for your phone. And then once you just get all the charges in there, and then they start to escape to the other side, across the gradient. They want to diffuse to the other side. As they diffuse, you lose energy from the cell gradually. You lose energy until they level out and there's basically no more energy. And then you take the same ions and transfer them again with an electric current, transfer them again into the other compartment, and that journey keeps going back and forth. This is how you generate electricity. So now that electric voltage situation, in addition to the diffusion, they together create two forces. Together we know them as the electrochemical gradient. And that gradient, usually they are in the same direction. Like, for example, when you have more potassium inside, the gradient inside is going to increase. So, and the electromagnetism is going to increase. So it wants to attract more. It wants to expel. So it's going to be a powerful force, two powerful forces combined together to attract ions from one side to the other side. So, the separation in charges between what's inside the cell and what's outside the cell, the voltage, that is called the membrane potential or the resting potential. So that membrane potential or resting potential is the difference in charges between the inside and outside. And at rest, it is going to always favor the flow of sodium inward, inside, and the flow of potassium outside. So the transport of cations or positive charges into the cell is that's what, the situation that it always wants to bring it in, and then anions are going to want to leave because there are more negative charges inside. So as soon as one sodium channel opens to bring one positive charge, like one sodium, because it's positive, then you need to lose another charge that is positive, because calcium is also positive. So sodium comes in, potassium leaves, and then you get it balanced this way. So the electrochemical gradient will cause sodium ions to diffuse inside into the cell very quickly in that case. And that will increase also when you bring sodium in, you have more positive charges inside. As a result, it's going to drive one out. So the membrane potential is also called the resting potential. Means how the electric charges are when the neuron is not firing. So the resting potential or the membrane potential is the net difference between the number of cytoplasmic charges and extracellular charges, negatives and positives, positive ions and negative ions. So the difference creates voltage against the cell membrane, and this voltage serves as a form of energy. So now the resting membrane potential, or the membrane potential, the resting potential of a neuron. There are different numbers. In the Reese chapter that I shared with you, summarized for you, they use a membrane potential of -60 to -80, because they kind of calculate, based on mammals and animals in addition to humans. But I'm going to give you one specifically for humans, and that is -60 to -70. That is the membrane potential for a human being. That means, just to explain it for you, it means, see if there's an image here. Okay. Okay, we'll just use this. The membrane or the resting potential being -60 to -70 for human beings. That means in the cytoplasmic, or inside of the cell, cytoplasmic side, there are more negatively charged ions. So ions that have one electron. So they are anions. So you have 60 to 70 negative ions inside, more than the positive ions inside the cell. So the difference between, again, what's inside the cell here, you have 60 to 70 negative ions more. So that is going to create a situation where there will be some kind of attraction. So this negativity inside the cell, once you give it a chance, the membrane opens or channels, they are going to suck in, to attract positive charges, because negative attracts positive. So I hope you understand what this means when I speak about the resting potential or the membrane potential, which is -60 to -70. If you tell me -80, that is fine as well. But I just wanted to make it specific to humans. So that is the situation when the neuron is not firing. This is always the situation. So you can think of it as like this, almost like a loaded gun. So it wants to be inside like this. While it is resting, it wants to be loaded all the time, with the negative charges inside more than outside. That is going to, as soon as you have a chance, something causes, like you open gates, then all the forces are going to attract or suck in ions that are positive inside. Once you change that membrane potential, then you create a powerful electric current that's going to send a message, that's going to create an action potential. That is the essence of that. So when you have that situation and the cell membrane, the negativity or the resting potential or the membrane potential is -60 to 80 or -60 to -70, and then at that case, the neuron is not firing, and then you get a signal from another neuron where a neurotransmitter binds on the receptor channel. Immediately, the receptor channel is going to allow ions. It's going to allow potassium or calcium, some ions, and usually sodium. So it's going to come in, and it, when it will, because that action, the neurotransmitter or the message that comes in from the other neuron is going to just basically open a lot of sodium channels. And as they open, you send a flood of sodium ions in, and that's going to increase the number of positive charges inside, and it will decrease the number of negative charges, and then that is going to alter the membrane potential, and it will cause the action potential. The cell that received the signal is going to create its own signal, and it will fire. So again, the action of the neurotransmitter and how the neurotransmitter alters the resting potential by allowing or blocking ions is what makes us as human beings able to fire signals, able to survive, to function, to behave, to speak. Anything at all that you can do as a human being is only possible by altering that negative resting potential or membrane potential. So as we speak, the whole thing now, neurotransmission, is about how to alter this membrane potential and how to create a firing. So when we set the resting potential inside of the cell, there are more negative charges than outside. And the negative and positive charges are balanced by the flow of sodium in and potassium out. That is going to kind of increase or decrease the charges inside in negativity or positivity. So when the resting potential becomes less negative, how? We said, here's the membrane. Inside of the membrane, you have 60 negative charges, 60 negatively charged ions, or 70 or 80 more than positive. So that is the natural way that it wants to stay at. What happens when you bring in 10 sodiums in? How many negative, if you bring in 10 sodiums, the negativity, the say minus 70, the negative 70 charges here, 70 ions, are going to be attracted, are going to be balanced by the 10 you bring in. So you have 10, and then that means you make the membrane inside, instead of 70 minus 70, you make it minus 60, because you have 10 positive charges that will balance the negativity of 10 of the 70 minus 70. So now you have decreased the action potential to 60 instead of minus 70, you made it minus 60. That means you decreased it. When you decrease it this way, decrease the negative charges, you bring the neuron closer to the firing state. So now, let's see. You have the membrane potential at negative 70, and now you bring in 15 sodiums in. What is the membrane potential going to be? From 70, and you bring in 15 sodiums, that is all positive, positive, positive. 15 are going to pair with 15 of the 70. So what is 70 minus 15? I hope you say 55. If that situation happens, so if the cell is, let's say, it goes to like 60 to 70, and it has like minus 70 or negative or 70 negative ions more. That means when you bring in 15 positive ions whatever it is, potassium or sodium or calcium, it doesn't matter. But if you bring in 15 charges from outside, that is going to counterbalance. It will take 15 out of this minus 70. So you only now are going to end up having 55, negative 55, or 55 negatively charged ions. If it reaches that negative 55 millivolts, that means that the cell is ready to fire an action potential. That's called the threshold. If it hits negative 55, no matter what, the cell is going to fire an action potential. So remember this number very well, because it's very important. Remember the membrane potential, what it is, how what's the value of it. Negative 60 to negative 70 in humans, negative 60 to negative 80 in mammals in general. So the neuron, again, will fire an action potential when the membrane potential is altered and decreased to minus 55 millivolts. So again, in terms of the sodium-potassium pump, we said the cell naturally has the negative 60 to negative 70 by nature. This can't happen given the diffusion of chemicals in and out based on their gradient, because if you let the chemicals like sodium, potassium flow in and out based on their gradients, you are going to end up having, instead of 100 and say 45, 140 inside and 5 out, you are going to have many, many more potassiums outside. I mean, naturally, you're going to have half here and half there. And for the potassium, calcium, you're going to have, or sodium, you're going to have half out and half in. So, but again, because the mechanism, sodium gates are mostly closed, there are less. So you have more positive charges outside than inside for sodium. And then potassium, wants to steadily, on a regular basis, to flow out because the gates are open all the time. So the sodium-potassium pump works to reverse, to make sure that the diffusion doesn't, to counterbalance the diffusion. Say, for example, if two potassiums go out, the sodium-potassium pump is going to make sure to bring in two charges. If there are more positive charges inside the cell, the sodium-potassium channel is going to ensure that more sodiums are out. So it counters the effect of diffusion, the natural state of diffusion. So, again, remember, is that sodium-potassium pump is going to work on the inside of the cell so that every time it wants to expel sodium, it wants to bring in potassium. This is what it wants to do all the time. So, as it opens to the inside gate opens like this, it is going to bind 3 sodiums, the inside. Once it binds them, 3 spots, it closes and it opens to the other side, outside of the membrane. And then it's going to, they're going to take off and will be dumped into the outside of the cell membrane. Then the sites for the sodiums are not going to be able to attract more. They will be in rest mode. And the only side, the side where there are two places for potassium are going to attract potassium from outside. And then every time take two potassiums and close it, bring them in. So in this case, if you have this pump, let's say one, of course there are millions of them, but let's say one pump, and it cranks 10 times. So 10 times it's going to take out sodium, dump it out, bring in two potassiums, dump them in, take sodium, 3, dump them out. How many sodiums will be transported to the outside, from the cell to the outside, in 10 cranks? So every time the channel transports 3 sodiums. So how many sodiums will be transported outside in 10 rounds? Okay. How many potassium ions will be brought from outside to the inside in the 10 times? So now, in order to understand the net difference between the charges, the net difference is going to create negative charges. So the number of sodiums that were expelled from the cell were 30 in 10 times. So you decreased the cell positivity. You took the 30 positive charges, threw them outside. You made the cell 30 negative charges more. Because again, if you take positive charges, you create, that means that there will be more negative charges inside. Now, so you took 30 plus 30 ions out. That's 30 positive charges. You threw them out. You made the cell less in positivity, more in negativity. Now you bring in 20 potassium ions. So what is the net difference? 30 minus 20. So 30 positive, and then you bring in 20 positive. And then the cell is still missing 10. So the cell will be negative 10. It will be negatively charged by 10 times, by 10 negative charges. So that adds to the already negative, charge of the membrane potential, the inside of the cell. So as diffusion continues, potassium goes out, then always that pump tries to bring in to make up what is lost. As potassium goes out, it brings potassium in, and then it takes the sodium outside to decrease the negativity. So it counterbalances the effective diffusion, and by doing so, the sodium-potassium channel maintains the negative membrane potential of the cell. So I'd like you to understand how many ions it will take in, how many K plus ions in, and how many sodiums out, and some basic calculations. The steps are here, and how the pump actually functions. I know this segment is a little bit too technical and stuff, but it is very important so that we can understand how neurons fire, and then go to bigger areas. So the action potential, which is firing, how does it occur? There are 5 phases for the action potential. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, let's go. So first, let's just speak about some other concepts, and then we'll go to the stages of the action potential. So there are, at rest, when the neurons, there are resting channels that function during rest. As, for example, the potassium channels, they are just open all the time, and the potassiums go in. So you have, let's say you have two channels, for example, potassium, one here, one here. So one potassium comes in, then another potassium goes out. One sodium comes in, one potassium goes. So one positive charge comes in, then you have one positive charge is gonna leave, so that they can always counterbalance each other. So resting channels maintain the resting membrane potential, while gated channels, for example, some of them open all the time and are not gated by changes in the membrane voltage. So the resting channels, again, they at rest, only some of them are open all the time. And they are not, these channels, like say potassium, for example, some of these channels are not gated. So the ions go in and out freely. I'd like you to delete the next segment here of the gated channels here, because I speak about them below. So it will be resting channels, maintain the resting membrane potential, and then just close, delete the three words that come after. So some of these resting channels are open all the time and are not gated by changes in membrane voltage. So some channels are gated by membrane voltage, but are open at the negative resting potential of the nerve. So for example, they are gated, but they are gated by an electric charge. If the electric charge reaches a certain level, then these gates open. Like say, for example, you have a neurotransmitter comes in, it's going to dump in a lot of sodium in, it will increase the positive charges inside, will decrease the negative charges, and as a result, that is going to change the conditions of the membrane, the cell membrane. So most voltage gated channels are closed when the membrane is at rest, because they have gates, and this is, you want to block, say for example, block sodium most of the time. So when the membrane is at rest, these voltage gated channels are closed almost most of the time, and they require membrane depolarization. So you have a neurotransmitter comes in, binds on it on the channel, and then it opens it, and this is going to allow in sodium, for example. And as sodium goes in, it is going to alter the membrane potential. It will cause the cell to fire. The term depolarization is the concept that means that the negative charges, the minus 60 or minus 70, negative 70 of the membrane potential or the resting potential, that number, if the charge is increased to a certain level, to negative 55, we call this depolarization. Okay, so anything that increases, decreases the brain potential, that means increases positive charges inside and decreases negative charges, and it makes less negative, and it moves the membrane potential from minus 60 or minus 70 to minus 55. When that happens, call this depolarization. It means bringing in the membrane potential closer toward its, its firing threshold. So again, that is depolarization. Depolarization is excitatory. It results in firing. And we are going to know hyperpolarization, which is inhibition, but we'll discuss it in the next couple of slides. So when depolarization approaches the threshold, then the cell immediately, spontaneously, when there's depolarization going to fire, the cell automatically opens these voltage-gated channels to allow an influx of sodium, and that is going to immediately lead to the action potential. So once you reach the negative 55, no matter what, now negative 55 means you have pulled the trigger. You cannot bring the bullet back. So anything that brings the membrane potential from that resting state to negative 55 millivolts, that is going to fire the action potential. There are two kinds of action potentials, actually. We never spoke about, no one probably is going to mention the graded action potentials, but we discuss it here because it's important. We said the action potential without the word graded, just to say plain action potential, that is the actual firing. So when you say, again, action potential, it means if it reaches negative 55, it is gonna fire. If the stimulus is small or big, or let's say, for example, you have a little firecracker and someone hits and it just makes the noise next to you. And then also not far from you, then you hear someone firing a gun. So obviously the gun is more robust, it's a greater stimulus. But will the firecracker cause a greater action potential than the gun shot, or then the gun will produce a greater action potential? An action potential is either all or none. It doesn't come in like big sizes and small sizes. It is always just one size for every molecule, every ion. There is one particular, the same copy image that it produces all the time, no matter what. So action potentials, you don't have little ones and big ones and stuff when you say the word plain action potential. And they either occur or do not occur, either fire or not fire. But the graded action potential is actually a condition where the positive charges come into the cell, positive ions like sodium come into the cell, and they just go and go to negative, let's say, close to 55, but there's no fire. They are not strong enough to reach negative 55, but they are there. The chemicals come in, and there's more positive charges than negative, and then the less negativity inside of the cell. And then whatever causes that then fades out. And as the time goes by, it fades more. As the distance goes, it fades even more. So they fade out by time and by the level of their strength. They come in various levels of strength. And most of them do not produce firing at all. So they die down mostly before they reach, they produce a firing state. The place that fires action potential is the axon HELAC. Okay, so the other kind of action potential that we know generally, that actual firing that occurs, is it either occurs or doesn't occur, and when it occurs, it has the same magnitude. There is not a huge potential versus a little, no, either occurs or not, and it's the same size all the time. So, regardless of the stimulus. So, how do we generate an action potential? First, when a neurotransmitter binds on a receptor channel, it's going to do one of two things. Excuse me. It's going to either close it, it's going to inhibit its action, block the gate, or open the gate, and by doing so, it's going to allow sodium in and other chemicals in, and that's going to, increase the positivity inside and decrease the negativity, and that's going to lead to the minus 55 millivolts threshold, and that will produce firing. So, that's in the case when the neurotransmitter is excitatory. So it can cause an increase in cytoplasmic positively charged ions. For example, by bringing in more sodium. So instead of negative 60 or let's say negative 70, then if you bring in 15 sodiums in, that means 15 positive charges are in, and that's going to cancel out the effect of 15 of this minus 70. Then you have minus 55 millivolts. That is the threshold that then the neuron is going to fire. That's one situation. If you bring positively charged ions in, you get firing. Or you can decrease the negativity or the negatively charged ions inside. You can either take out more positive charges out of the cell and dump them out. Then when you take out the more positive charges, every time you take one, then the cell is one negative one more. If you take 5, then the cell is negative 5 more. So the more you take positive charges you take out, the more negative the inside of the cell is gonna be. So that means, you are bringing in, for example, the cell, moving it from minus 70 to minus 80 to minus 90 to more negative. That makes it less likely to fire. And this is what we call hyperpolarization or inhibition. You prevent the cell from firing. That is an inhibitory action potential. And when it makes it fire, that will be excitatory. So, again, when a neurotransmitter causes the inside of the neuron to move to the firing threshold, we call this depolarization. And depolarization, it causes an action potential. It makes the neuron fire. And again, depolarization brings the neuron to the negative 55 millivolts threshold, and that makes it fire. The opposite situation, as I explained, it happens when the neurotransmitter increases, either brings in negative charges like chloride, negative charges into the cell to add more to the negativity, or take out positive charges out of the cell, dump them out, so that you can increase the number of negative charges inside of the cell relative to the positive ones. So I told you, negative charges always wants to attract positive charges. For every negative positive charge, if you let the fluid go in and out, you're going to have a positive charge, you're going to have a negative one. An ion that is negative, you have an ion that is positive. And you keep the same numbers like that. So if you have, say, a situation where you have 4 and 4, so this is negative, this is positive. If you take out 2 positives, that means you have more negatives here. That means that is similar to the membrane potential. So it is all just the difference in charges between negative ions and positive ions. So if you increase the number of negative charges inside of the neuron, you create hyperpolarization. You make the cell move away from the firing threshold, and you move it in the opposite direction by increasing the action potential, by making it less likely to fire, inhibiting its function. So hyperpolarization is inhibitory because it inhibits and prevents the neuron from firing. There are 4 or 5 phases, 5 phases or 6 of the action potential. How do we exactly produce it? First, you start with the resting phase. At the resting phase, the gated sodium channels and the gated potassium channels are closed. Remember, gated means they are controlled by either an electric current or a neurotransmitter. And then you have other channels, like especially potassium, that are not gated, and the potassium flows in and out freely. So that is what is happening at the resting phase. Then the next phase is the depolarization phase. You have a stimulus, like say someone yells or speaks, or you hear a noise, whatever. So that stimulus causes a neurotransmitter to bind on a receptor channel in the synapse, in the postsynaptic terminal. So that neurotransmitter will dock on the channel, and it's going to open the gate to allow in sodium in. So a stimulus causes depolarization, means it brings in more positive charges by allowing in sodium, by making sodium channels open automatically. Once the neurotransmitter binds, it's going to open the sodium channels. That is going to increase the number of positive charges in the cell, and that will decrease the number of negative charges, bringing it from negative 70 or negative 80 to negative 55 millivolts. And then as a result, that is the trigger that activates the action potential. Depolarization. So now we haven't, see, that is the place where we are driving the cell away from, in the direction of the firing. So when you have the rising phase now, the depolarization causes most sodium channels to open at that time, rising phase. That causes an influx. Just a lot of sodium, just ions come in. Remember, there's more outside. So we get an influx from outside into the cell. So you have all these positive charges coming in, and that increases the positivity, decreases the negativity. But the gated potassium channels remain closed. So now as you bring in more sodium, then the gated calciums do not open. They remain closed to prevent, them from leaking out to the other side. So the increase in cytoplasmic, or the inside of the cell, the calcium inside, potassium inside, sodium inside of the cell, that's going to decrease the resting potential. That is going to make the resting potential less than -70 or less than -80. It will bring it closer to -55 millivolts. It moves it toward the threshold. So that is, again, depolarization. And here are the steps summarized. You can, read them, expand the image and read them. And then you have the falling phase. Now you have fired, basically, and at that, immediately after, most of the sodium channels become inactivated. They by being inactivated, no more sodium comes in. So at this very moment, most potassium channels now open. So what do you think the potassium is going to do? Is it going to come in? Is it going to go out? Because now there's more sodium, a lot of sodium inside. And the sodium, there are only a few gates that can allow it to go out. And at the same time, potassium now, the gates are now open. So you're going to have an outflux of potassium leaving the cell. So again, that's going to cause an outflow of potassium escaping from inside the cell to the outside. And that's going to bring back, by taking out more, say, if you brought in 15 sodiums, now you're going to have 15 potassiums go outside again, and that's going to make the difference, and it will bring back the membrane potential to its resting state. So if at that point in time, remember, at that point in time, the potassium channels are inactive, the sodium are inactivated. The potassium are open. But at that particular point in time, if a second depolarization occurs during the falling phase, it will not produce an effect. It will fail to generate an effect. So, however, if enough of these failed depolarizations, if enough of them occur, they could add up to a force that can convince the axon HeLoC to fire. Okay, that's again a special condition. So again, because the sodium channels are still inactivated, because they just did their job and they take a little break, that is not going to allow a second polarizing stimulus to cause another action potential. It can't happen because the sodium channels are resting. They are inactivated. So the inability of the depolarization to generate a second firing during the falling phase is called the refractory period, the resting period. So again, the refractory period is the inability of a depolarization to generate a second firing during the falling phase of the action potential. So I'd like you to know this definition. Now, there's an undershoot, there's a little kind of fine touch to end that firing process. And to finally bring the membrane potential to its previous status. So the remaining sodium channels close at that and then the undershoot stage. So once they close, they prevent more sodium from coming in, while some potassium channels remain open. That will allow more potassium to go out. So as the potassium channels start to close, the sodium channels are still unblocked. They are unblocked, but they cannot take in anything. They are still closed, but they don't have the locks on them. So the neuron at this very nanosecond, it regains its resting potential. So now you go back to 140 potassiums inside, 5 outside, you have 150 sodiums out, 15 inside. So now we said, their action potential either occurs or doesn't occur, and it has one single magnitude, one size, as you see in the bottom in the image here, and that's it for this particular a chemical that produces this action potential. That is just that. Every time it produces it, it will be exactly a mirror image of this. But what makes a stimulus make a greater impact? Obviously, why does the bullet, why does the firing of the gun produce a greater effect on you than they say a firecracker? So the reason is this. We say a depolarizing stimulus is anything that causes firing. Like you say a sound. You say something, and I hear you. Now you caused depolarization. You made neurotransmitters bind to my channels, and I start to transmit signals. So a stronger stimulus, or depolarizing stimulus, like a louder sound, for example, it will not cause bigger action potentials, but it will produce a greater effect, obviously. The greater effect is caused by the fact that a greater stimulus causes more action potentials to occur per second. It increases the frequency of the action potentials in 1 second. So, for example, increasing the rate of action potentials, when you increase that in a motor neuron or motor neurons, that will cause the action of the muscle to be stronger. So the contraction will last longer, will be more powerful. That's what, if you have more action potentials produced per second in these muscles. So again, a greater stimulus causes a greater response, not because it will make a greater action potential. It will cause a greater response because it increases the rate or the frequency of action potentials or firing in 1 second. Per whatever period of time. It makes it fire faster and it fires more. So the frequency or rate of action potentials per second is the only factor in how information is encoded, how information, is taken into the brain, and how it is transmitted along an axon. So that, again, the greater the frequency of the firing, the greater the flow of the information and the channeling of that information. And again, the rate at which the axons within nerves conduct action potentials govern how rapidly an animal can react to danger or opportunity, like agility, for example. If someone is focused and agile, that means that their brain is making more action potentials per second. They are alert all the time. If someone is kind of lethargic, or they are, not the opposite of being active, that means they are not they are firing at a slow pace, and they don't produce, they are not agile. They are not rapid. They are not fast. Okay, so we'll look at the presynaptic action potential, how do we produce it, and we'll look at the postsynaptic potential, how we produce it. Things are going to be much easier from this point, as we move to bigger structures. related to the previous section, you should have had that in high school. I mean, all the neurotransmission and so the presynaptic action potential. We speak about it first. The action potential is only produced in one particular area in the neuron, and that area is the axon hillock. So when we say the presynaptic action potential, imagine this. Here is a neuron, axon. Here are the telodendria, or let's say the synaptic terminals. Here is another neuron. These are the dendrites. So we take one dendrite, we have one synaptic terminal, we have a synapse. We said the synaptic gap or cleft or space, what is before it, the cell that is sending the signal, we call it the presynaptic neuron. The cell that is receiving the signal that is on the other side of the synapse is called the postsynaptic neuron. So when we speak about presynaptic action potential, we speak about the action potential that is produced in the axon hillock, and how this action potential, this firing, travels from the axon hillock down to the through the axon, down through the axon terminals. And then this axon, axon terminal is going to release a neurotransmitter that is going to cause firing in the next neuron. That is the post-synaptic action potential. So we'll speak about the presynaptic, how the axon hillock generates an action potential, and then we discuss how that action potential is transferred to the next cell. So the action potentials are generated again, always in one single place and no other places in the neuron. It's in the axon hillock. And then it is transmitted through the axon, the axon itself. Let me get to the image here. So the axon hillock is the little piece, it's a triangular area that connects the axon to the cell body. So exactly the area where lower kind of triangle of the cell body that connects with the axon hillock. Now you see the segments here of myelin, white. What kind of myelin insulates this neuron? Obviously, this is a peripheral nervous system neuron. So what kind of myelin and what kind of, cell makes this kind of myelin? So you know the answer. You should know it from the previous section. But anyways, look at the nodes of Ranvier in between the signals. Now, myelin, let's look at the big segments here. Myelin is an insulator. It insulates the pieces of the axon from the fluid inside and outside the cell. So the fluid doesn't come in contact with the axon, axon pieces that are covered, that are insulated by myelin. And these pieces under the myelin have no channels at all. They have no sodium channels. They have no potassium channels. And then the segments in between the axon, between the little areas, and the nodes of Ranvier, these are the only areas that have sodium channels. So, first, the axon is the area that receives every single thing that comes into that neuron. From every, it has thousands, the neuron has thousands of synapses. I mean, thousands of synapses coming from dendrites and from the cell body. Some neurons synapse with 50,000 or more, 50,000 other neurons or more. So, in addition, some of these synapses are inhibitory. They bring in, signals to say to the cell, do not fire, do not fire, do not fire. Some of them are excitatory. Says, go, fire, fire, fire. So in addition to that, there are thousands of these graded action potentials that, come in, cause sodium to come in, but not enough to bring the firing to the threshold. And then they start to die down, these graded potentials. They start. So before they reach the axon hillock, but some of these graded action potentials, actually, they weak, but they reach the axon hillock. So if you get, say, for example, like 10,000 of them, all weak, they add to a powerful, force. And that is going to convince the axon hillock to fire a signal. If there are enough ungraded potentials that are very, very weak that come to it, that means they are kind of, hesitant. Why not? Go ahead and fire. And the axon hillock also is going to decide when to fire, when not to fire. You have some synapses telling you fire, fire, and some say no. How do I decide? So how it decides is it calculates the positive or the signals that say excite, and the signals that say inhibit, and it kind of says if you have more synapses that are inhibitory, that are sending inhibitory signals, then the axon hillock is going to inhibit the function of the neuron. And if there are more that are saying, go ahead and fire, that the number is more, then the axon hillock is going to fire an action potential. That means it's like a democratic, ruler. It gets all the mix of messages and so on. If there are enough people to say, let's vote on this, or let's actually do it, even if their voices are small and not very powerful, they add up to some kind of reasonable force, and the action potential is fired. And if there are more inhibitory signals coming from synapses, then that is going to make it inhibit. If there are more excitatory signals coming in, it will make it fire. So when the the firing actually first is generated in the action potential, the action potential is generated in the axon hillock. It flows. Let me go back to it. It's going to flow through the axon. So again, the axon is itself. You could see it beneath the insulation. So the signal is going to flow through until it reaches the first node of Ranvier, because there are no sodium channels before that. When it reaches the first node of Ranvier, it's going to depolarize the channels in that area, that segment. And that segment, node of Ranvier, is open to the cytoplasmic fluid, and it's open to the extracellular fluid outside, exposed. And the channels are doing their action. So that's going to produce regenerate the depolarization here. And then the fluid is the current is going to flow into the segment beneath the myelin. and then it's going to reach the next node of Ranvier, and it will depolarize it. It is going to cause it to regenerate the action potential again, and then it's gonna keep flowing in. So what you see now, the firing, you're gonna see every node of Ranvier flash and stop. Before it stops, the next one flashes. Before it stops, the next one flashes. The next one flashes. They are not jumping, really. The signals themselves are not jumping. The signals are flowing through the axon, but they appear as if they are jumping. So these two things will happen at the same time when the action potential is regenerated at the node of Ranvier, the first one. So the first node of Ranvier immediately deactivates sodium. As soon as it just copies the action potential, it's going to give a break to the sodium gates. It will close them, and this way it will switch to a refractory mode. It cannot fire another action potential again. So again, it just moves on the charge to the next, and then it immediately closes, takes a break. And this way, that will prevent the signal from going back again. This is why the signal travels in a neuron only in one direction, only from the direction of the axon hillock to the terminals. So the current continues to the next node of Ranvier to repeat the process. So it will be like dominoes. One falls, it causes the next to fall, it causes the next quickly, and then you have this cascade effect. How now the signal reaches the presynaptic terminal, and now how do we transfer, send the signal from that through the synapse through the next neuron, the postsynaptic neuron? How do we make the postsynaptic neuron build an action potential and fire it because of that signal that came from the other one? So first, at the synapse, the synaptic terminal releases the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, as I explained in the previous section. And that is the binding of the neurotransmitter onto the receptor channels is going to cause to open the sodium channels, and that will cause sodium's ions to go into the cell, and that is going to increase its positivity. It will decrease its negativity. It will bring it to depolarization, which is until it reaches negative 55 millivolts. Then it's gonna cause it now to fire. So the depolarization minus 55 millivolts reaches the axon hillock. And the axon hillock then, no matter what, you just pulls the trigger and the action potential is fired. And that is going to produce axon firing is basically another presynaptic signal. So the neurotransmitter in the postsynaptic, the neurotransmitter binds to a channel, and it opens the channel to allow more sodium in, and that is going to change the membrane potential in the direction of the threshold, and that is going to finally the signal of depolarization goes to the axon hillock, and the axon hillock will produce the next cycle another presynaptic potential. So if the presynaptic if the presynaptic neurotransmitter, the neurotransmitter coming from the neuron that sends the signal, if it increases the brain potential, for example, by making it more negative, by making it from minus 70, making it minus 80, minus 90, for example, minus 85 or something like that, that is going to hyperpolarize the neuron. It will make it less likely, it will increase its negativity, will make it less likely to fire. We call this inhibition, or we call it an inhibitory post-synaptic potential. So inhibitory, and where is it happening? In the postsynaptic neuron, or the neuron on the other side, or the postsynaptic neuron. So if the action potential, if the action of the neurotransmitter results in depolarization, that means it decreases the action potential, the membrane potential, brings it closer to minus 55 millivolts, the threshold, that is going to cause the axon HeLac to generate an excitatory postsynaptic action potential. Okay, so it is gonna either inhibit or excite. If it produces hyperpolarization, it will inhibit. If it depolarizes, it will excite. So I explained here that, as I explained before, that the axon HeLac receives hundreds of thousands and thousands of excitatory and inhibitory signals, and it has to decide which, if it's going to fire, if it's not going to fire. So it has to do a lot of calculations, integration of different signals from different sides, sources, and then it makes its decision. So, again, it makes its decision based on how many weak graded potentials are coming in. If there's enough of them, the action, they add to a big force, the action, axon HeLac will fire a signal as a result. If, for example, if there are, in certain cases, the positive and negative signals, or what we call inhibition and inhibitory signals, are coming in from the dendrites and the cell body, and excitatory signals are coming in at the same time. So what will the axon HeLac follow? It is the majority. The more inhibitory signals, the more likely that the axon HeLac will inhibit, will produce the hyperpolarization, and the more excitatory, the more likely that it will produce an excitatory action potential. So this concludes the segment on neural transmission, and the quiz will be available soon. So please do view this more than once, view the slides, and also read the part of the chapter summary that you had that includes this information. And come tomorrow, or Tuesday, come to class ready with questions. I am going to make a list of questions. If you do not ask me, I will be asking you. And so I hope that you really get this, understand this really well. And like I said, it's a revision. It should be a review of what you studied in biology, whether in high school or in biology 101 or biology 100. So we'll see you next time in class. Thank you.